big birthday last week and hadn't been to my hometown in more than 20 years. So I came down to Atlantic City, which is where I grew up, and I got to walk around the town, had a very good time with my sister. And actually, you can see outside the hotel. So that's the boardwalk, right? Let's see if I get right here. And that's Convention Hall, where they used to have the Miss America pageant. And I grew up right down, all the way down there. And a beautiful view of the ocean. So thank you, Shanti, for wishing me a happy birthday. Thank you, Terry. Okay, all right. So let me get things organized on my screen. And I'm glad you're seeing that the chat box seems to be working well. Let me minimize my screen and we will get started. A bunch more people came in. Hey, Sheila, Shirley, Terry, Linda, Leslie. All right. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the history of medicine because it gives us a good perspective on where we are and where we're headed. And I think it also gives us a little bit of context in terms of how to take more control over our overall health. Because once we see that we are thinking in sort of a little bit of a paradigm of we sort of think of medicine as just the way it is, and essentially when you start to see how it developed and how it could have turned out a completely different way, it gives you a little bit more of a perspective on modern medicine. So let me share my screen and we will get started. Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. And I'm calling tonight's talk a brief history of how we got here. Because as I said, what we're going to be speaking about tonight is really getting a clear understanding of how modern medicine evolved. By seeing that, we can see some of the deficits, some of the things that it's missing, which in turn can allow us to get a better appreciation of what we can do for ourselves and for our families. So let's talk a little bit about the overall importance. Let me know if you're seeing my screen. Just because, again, I'm using my laptop as opposed to my home computer. So just want to make sure that you can see what I am sharing. So just type that into the chat. Let me know. Okay, great. Thank you, Terry. All right. So why is it important? One of the reasons it's important is because in terms of modern society now, we're dealing with a situation where we have actually increasing censorship of just even talking about, hold on, I think my audio is, sorry, 1 second. Okay, all right, hopefully the audio now is better. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Trisha and Shanti. All right. So a lot of us take for granted actually how the medicine we have, basically, we just think of it as the way it is. And what you're going to see is, as I said earlier, that it could have turned out a completely different way. It just is the way it happened is an interesting story and has all kinds of intrigue and lots of things that happened along the way. Another reason why it's important to go through this is because we're seeing increased censorship of just non-mainstream ideas. And oddly enough, when we look at the deficits of modern medicine, even if there are people who post about that on social media and they get banned by just pointing out some of the deficits. So it's important for us to have an open mind to just looking at the history and having sort of an objective view of it. Additionally, people are narrowing their views based on just staying inside their own bubbles. And again, looking at history, again, gives you a wider view of things so that you can make sure that you're not getting into some sort of narrow social media bubble. And obviously, it's always important to think outside the box, because if we can't think outside the box, then we're stuck in the box and we're going to be subjected to in terms of medicine. In other words, we should always have an idea of when we're going in for medical treatment or we're taking care of our overall health, looking at it from multiple perspectives and not thinking that just one perspective is the right way to think about it. Because if you can just go around the world into different cultures and you're going to see that just on every single topic, including the treatment of medicine, there are varying types of options. I'll give you just as an example, even within the realm of conventional medicine, which of course I'm a member of, it was always interesting to me to go to international meetings. And I remember I was at an international meeting in Paris, a dermatology meeting, and what was amazing was hearing how different people from different countries treated the same conditions. And the reason it was so mind blowing to me is because if you were to ask me before that meeting that there's a certain disease and this is the medicine that you give, and then all of a sudden I'm hearing that in another country, even though we're still members of the same um, specialty and we're trained very similar way, in this particular country the treatment is completely different, just 100% different, but they get the same results, but they've chosen a different form of therapy. So even again within the confines of one type of thinking, there's always going to be these ideas that are going to be wide and varied, and it's not as simple as just people tend to make it out to be. So where are we now when it comes to health and modern medicine? Well, unfortunately, we have an epidemic of various of huge proportions. Obviously, we have a pandemic going on, but we also have an explosion of chronic disease. We have environmental catastrophes. We have a speed of extinctions that is growing. There was a book written, I think, in mid 2010s. I think it was called The Sixth Extinction, that really speaks about, from a historical perspective, that it looks like we're about to undergo a massive extinction of species. And of course, one could even make the case that when we look at the declining sperm counts and all kinds of other issues, hormonal, there's an epidemic of precocious puberty around the world where girls are going into puberty much sooner than before. All of these things have impacts that are the result. These impacts are the result of environmental toxins and a whole host of things that are going on. And some people, in a scary way, really feel like humans are in the process of making the shift to not being able to reproduce. It's something like 1 in 4 men in America don't have adequate sperm counts, and it's just like a similar situation in terms of declining fertility in women as well, unfortunately. So there's major problems going on. Obviously, autism spectrum disorders are increasing. We have increasing allergies. I mean, I remember growing up and allergies really, kids had allergies, but now, peanut allergies are, are pervasive. Kids have all kinds of crazy allergies. Apparently in most schools, there's giant lists of, this student has, zucchini allergy. This student has, these are things that didn't exist in the past. And we'll get into a little bit about why that might be. But ultimately, human health in general is really not improving in any significant way. A lot of people are thinking that some of this is related to some historical things in regards to the environment, and they relate that back to the conversion of our economy into what they call a fossil fuel economy, which is really where after World War II, and there was this buildup of the war machine, and after that, after World War II, a lot of that got diverted into creating chemical fertilizers. And what that did was it really made a shortcut. In other words, it allowed farmers to use these chemical fertilizers as opposed to doing composting and rotational crop management, traditional regenerative practices that ensured that the soil had micronutrients, it had fungi. In other words, the biome of the soil was healthy. And when you have these monocropped fields of corn and soybeans, you're not really contributing necessarily to the biome of the planet, the biome of the soil, that being a mix of bacteria and fungi, and the fungi are so very important to the soil. Those it's a nice trend that we're seeing now, small regenerative farms that are every year basically growing more soil, contributing to the overall environmental integrity of the farm in such a way that it continues to grow year by year. That's something, it's been something that's been of interest to me, and there's lots of ways of, there's no-till farming now where they don't have to even break the soil. There's so many amazing things happening, and a lot of people feel that it's a return to something that we haven't been doing for a long time, and they trace this back to this fossil fuel economy where, again, where the war machine contributed to creating these chemical fertilizers and not contributing necessarily to the the health of the soil. Some people say that there's only a certain number of years of where the topsoil is essentially going to be gone, and that's a result of using these sort of shortcuts. And then, of course, comes glyphosate and Roundup, and this particular product, this herbicide, is essentially an antibiotic, basically, and it blocks enzymes that basically are going to produce a loss of amino acids, which are the basic building blocks of the plant. And unfortunately, when it gets into us, it's causing a whole host of other problems. It's also chelating minerals, so you're not going to be able to get the same mineral content in your food, and it's certainly not going to help the soil. So again, more micronutrient deficiencies that we see. I've been ordering micronutrient tests on patients, and I'm amazed that even people who are eating well don't necessarily have micronutrient counts that are healthy, unfortunately. And part of that has to do with the fact that a carrot that we eat now versus a carrot that grew 30 or 40 years ago are two completely different things. They may taste the same. They maybe they don't taste the same. I don't know but honestly, you're not getting the same mineral content. Again, you're not contributing to the overall soil, and we are animals that exist in unique interdependence with everything around us, including the soil. So when the soil is not good, that's going to translate into the plants that we eat, the animals that we eat, and to the overall microbial biome. We've spoken about the gut microbiome quite a bit, but quite frankly, the microbiome that exists on us, in us, around us has to be completely healthy for us to be healthy as a species. So we can't just pay attention just to, say, our gut microbiome without understanding that we are connected to the environment around us. And unfortunately, with glyphosate around, that is basically diverting a whole host of things that should be used for our the basic building blocks are being taken away. And there's a doctor by the name of Zach Bush that speaks quite a bit about the dangers of glyphosate, and he even says something to the effect of, can nature survive at all, in terms of the basic building blocks being taken away, which is what's happening with glyphosate. It's in just about everything, unfortunately. It's been found in most California wines. I saw a report a couple months ago about that. It's almost impossible to avoid. It's a terrible thing. In addition, it disrupts the barriers of the body. So it's going to disrupt the gut barrier. It's going to disrupt, and once the gut barrier is broken, there's a whole host of other barriers that are broken, disrupting the barrier between the blood-brain barrier. And this disruption of barriers that we're seeing with glyphosate is also one of the reasons why we're seeing this whole host of increased incidence of allergies, because if these barriers are basically shielding our body from the outside. So if we are eating foods that aren't supposed to, certain markers of those foods are not supposed to get into our blood. They're supposed to be, of course, digested, broken down, but the allergic parts are not supposed to seep into the blood. And unfortunately, that is a situation where we're going to be getting these increased allergies. So that is another reason why glyphosate is probably contributing to all this incidence of allergies. I'm getting some complaints that there's a tapping background noise. Is everyone getting that? Maybe it's my headphones. Move this around a little bit. Okay. Okay, let's see how I'm gonna correct this. Is it still happening now? I'm holding on to the cord. Okay, good. I think it was the cord that was. I'll just hold on to the cord the way I'm doing it now. Okay, thank you. Whenever there's an issue with audio, video, whatever, please do comment. Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Terry. Okay, so to summarize so far, what we've stressed so far is that we have a significant issue with human health that is, quite frankly, not the result of modern medicine in any way, but a result of just some historical things that have happened, as well as a degradation in the environment that's been responsible partly from the way agriculture has evolved. And unfortunately, we're also getting a problem with being able to share ideas that fall outside the mainstream. And while this doesn't sound like it falls out of the mainstream, I can tell you that even though the science on glyphosate is pretty solid, unfortunately, talking about glyphosate is sometimes labeled as fringe, unfortunately. And there's lots of reasons why that is in terms of the propaganda around glyphosate. But the science behind glyphosate is pretty solid. Okay, so let's go into a little bit of a history of our medical system, because if we're going to tackle what we've just spoken about in terms of understanding the environmental degradation and how we exist in a symbiotic relationship with the environment, and how is modern medicine going to handle that, we have to have an understanding of how our medical system has evolved. So ultimately, when we're talking about the West, it all evolved from Greek medicine. And Greek medicine essentially evolved over many, many years. I think the first report goes back to something like 70 BC. And this is just a general definition from Wikipedia. What was a compilation of theories and practices that were constantly expanding through new ideologies and trials. Many components were considered in ancient Greek medicine, intertwining the spiritual and the physical. The reason I like that definition is because the Greek medicine didn't separate between the mind and the body. That only happened in the 1700s, believe it or not. We'll get into a little bit about that later. The Greek medicine, speaking about medicine in the West, was actually adopted overall by the Romans. Then the Romans, once sort of that civilization died out, the texts were actually preserved by in Arabic by Muslims, and they carried the ancient Greek texts. So they came through Rome, then it went into the Arabic, and then from the Arabic it got back translated into back introduced into the West. So I've spoken about Maimonides in the past, and of course, who was a physician in the Middle Ages, a Jewish physician in the Middle Ages, and of course he learned that from the Arabic texts of the time, which is where most people were studying the Greek medicine in the Middle Ages. That's where it was preserved. So Greek medicine is partially the beginning of sort of Western medicine. But I always like to say that the connection between the mind and the body was there was no separation in Greek medicine. When it comes to modern medicine, we'll get into that a little bit more, but ultimately it revolved around integrating laboratory evaluations into the treatment of medicine. And the history of labs is very interesting. Pythagoras had labs where he would test sounds and all sorts of things. Alchemy, where people were trying to create, from base metal trying to create gold. They created all these labs to try to be able to create gold. And alchemy is actually one of the founding. Alchemy essentially turned into chemistry. So people were trying to convert, lead to gold, but they were trying through so many different techniques. This was sort of the creation of the chemistry lab, and so labs started to develop back in the 1600s from alchemy, and then swing back all the way to what they call big science, which started in World War II, where you had gigantic labs with incredible amounts of resources, and that's sort of the history of laboratories as they go. Now, an understanding of our medical system wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about the germ theory. Now, the germ theory basically says that there are human diseases that are caused by germs, bacteria, viruses, etc. And the story of the germ theory is actually a very interesting one. But ultimately, it's important to understand because it is really the first part of what modern medicine is. So I believe it was there was a doctor by the name of Semmelweis. I'm not sure where he was. I want to say he was in Hungary, or actually maybe Austria. Not really sure. But what he recognized was, first of all, no one really knew that there were bacteria before Louis Pasteur essentially was the one that sort of really started to understand this. Dr. Semmelweis was noticing that women were dying after childbirth from fever. And he thought it might have something to do with the fact that the doctors were going from the cadaver lab right over into delivering babies. And what he decided to do was to do a study to see whether if they were basically would wash their hands in sort of a lime solution to see if there would be an increased survival after birth. And sure enough, after it sounds like simple, right? Obviously they're washing their hands, but there was no concept even in their frame of mind that there were little microscopic things that could potentially cause disease. This just wasn't in their frame of reference. So Dr. Semmelweis actually did a study where he had one wing of the hospital, I believe, where they didn't, wash with his special solution, and another wing where they did, and the decrease in disease was so incredible that it went from like a huge amount to virtually nothing. Unfortunately, the doctors didn't particularly like the fact that this guy was telling them that they had to wash their hands. They thought it didn't make any medical sense to them, even if they saw that it was doing something. And Semmelweis, unfortunately, I mean, you could imagine how angry he would have been. He's saving all these women's lives, and he's being ridiculed by his physician colleagues for making them wash their hands because they thought it was just an inconvenience that made no sense. And unfortunately, he couldn't back it up in terms of explaining to them from a scientific perspective why they should wash their hands. He really couldn't come up with a scientific reason, even though he knew that there was something on their hands that they were probably transferring from the cadavers over. He couldn't articulate because there was no germ theory at the time. There was no notion of microbes causing disease. Unfortunately, he became incredibly vocal and was writing and continued to be ridiculed because he couldn't come up with a scientific explanation, despite the fact that he had done numerous studies. He had a nervous breakdown, and his colleagues actually committed him to an insane asylum where he was beaten and died in an insane asylum for this. Unbelievable story. Then comes Louis Pasteur, who, of course, we all know from our grade school with pasteurization of milk and such. But he also was essentially the prime thinker when it comes to the development of the germ theory. That, in fact, there are germs that essentially can cause disease. Of course, to us, it makes complete sense. But we have to understand that when there is a new paradigm and a new thing comes on the scene, it's not taken up so kindly. As an example, with Semmelweis, of course, Louis Pasteur was able to do various studies, and of course, he was also involved in the rabies vaccine, which saved many lives as well. But unfortunately, anytime a new paradigm comes in, it always swings potentially too far in one way. And that meant that up until even now, sterilization was king and still is in a lot of senses. And of course, we've spoken about so far today about this biome concept of the earth and how we are integrated with the earth. And we don't want to sterilize. We don't want to overly sterilize things. Of course, we want to get rid of disease-causing microbes, but we can also go too far. And a lot of people think that this idea that everything has to be sterilized is an issue. And many of us have heard of the theories behind the over sterilization and allergies. That's another thing that some people contribute to allergies, and the fact that kids, some homes, everything is wiped down with alcohol, and kids are not encouraged to play in the dirt because of microbes or whatever the case may be. And some people feel that's also contributing to allergies. The truth is that our biome there's bacteria all over us, in us, species that are specific to under our arms, on our breasts, everywhere. And we don't want to sterilize because there's this delicate balance between all these bacteria living in us, on us, outside of us, and so this concept of over-sterilization has become an issue. Now, Louis Pasteur had an arch rival, and his name was Antoine Béchamp, and while his theory basically was against the germ theory. Unfortunately, there are a fair number of bizarre anti-germ theory people out there who actually don't think there is such a thing as a germ theory. It's pretty fringe, as you can imagine, but they take up Antoine Béchamp's theories because he spoke about the terrain. In other words, something that we've spoken about thus far, that we need to be in balance with the terrain. He felt that a perfectly healthy organism wouldn't get an infection under favorable conditions, but he wasn't able to articulate necessarily why, and the reasons that he said aren't necessarily valid right now with what we know of modern science. Nonetheless, this idea that the terrain, in other words, the balance between our bodies and the external environment, is one that we have to think about a little bit more seriously now because of the modern problems that we've spoken about in terms of the decreasing fertility and the increasing toxins and all that sort of thing. Okay, so we started now with the germ theory, and what comes next is the era of antibiotics. And this is, in the 40s to the 60s, 1940s to 1960s. And it was an amazing era because here we have Louis Pasteur in 1822 to 1895, and it took a little while before we actually had, specific agents that called antibiotics, of course, that we could use to kill disease-causing microbes. And that was an amazing revolution in medicine. Incredible. It actually lengthened the lifespan of people who were dying in youth and young age of infections. It got rid of that. I mean, it's amazing. When you read history, one of the people I've read many books about is Abraham Lincoln. When you read biographies about those times, people were just dying. Death was such a predominant part of their life because people were dying of infections. So the era of antibiotics was really amazing. That led to the era of the genome, and the era of the genome was where everyone got excited about the fact that it seemed like diseases were caused by genes. Of course, we now know after the genome was, they basically decoded the genome, that there are a whole host of other things external to the gene that are contributing to it. So-called epigenetics. There's things in the environment that cause expression of genes, and it's not just the genetic code that is causing your problems. It's usually a contribution of the environment and the inputs to your body. Right now, I believe we're in something called the era of inflammation, where a lot of the new medications, especially when it comes to chronic diseases, which all have sort of an inflammatory base to them, all these new generation of medicines are related to inflammation. And what's next? Well, I think what's next is this theory of the terrain. In other words, understanding all of the contributing external factors when it comes to, again, we spoke about the biome uh, and a whole host of things that are surrounding and contributing to overall health. We'll see what happens. No mention of modern medicine would be complete without talking about a report that was done by an Abraham Flexner in 1910. And this is a really interesting report. Now, I will tell you that if you type in Flexner report into Google or any search engine, you're going to find a fair number of alternative medicine physicians who see it as a conspiratorial document to get rid of all alternative medicine. And I do not share that view. They often say that it was a report that was financed by Carnegie and then reinforced by Rockefeller. A lot of people, again, in the alternative medicine community, say that it was a complete sham, that it was Rockefeller trying to make money off of, pharmaceutically, fostering the pharmaceutical movement, and therefore making money off of petrochemicals that could be used to create medicines. Anyway, let's take a look at it so you have a more objective view. Now, Abraham Flexner was an educator. He was a teacher, and he was hired by Carnegie to do an evaluation of the medical schools. And we're talking about all medical schools: botanical medicine, homeopathic medicine, general medicine, etc. And he traveled throughout the country looking at all the different types of medical schools that were out there. Now, he was enamored by the laboratory origin type of medicine and science and education in Germany. He was really enamored by, he was in love with this type of rigid scientific evaluation. But unfortunately, it didn't really, it certainly didn't foster an ideal relationship between the patient and the doctor. So science and its basis in lab evaluation was basically what he felt was deemed to be the proper place for the physician. And he, as I said, he was enamored Okay, well, I'm on my, hopefully you can hear me. I'm on my phone. I'm not sure exactly what happened. Apologize for that. If you can hear me, please do. Okay, great. Not going to be able to share my screen, unfortunately, but that's okay. We can talk about it anyway. Okay, good. I'm glad you could hear me. Let me take this off and apologize for that. Okay, so the Flexner report, what I was saying about the Flexner report before we got disconnected was essentially that as a result of this, as a result of the Flexner report, 1/3 of all medical schools closed because they didn't follow the just rigid scientific things that he was advocating. It also got rid of all botanical medicine and essentially signed a death certificate, death sentence to homeopathy, as well as other types of what he considered to be non-scientifically rigid science. Now, it's important to put this into context because it sounds like having a rigid scientific basis would be good. There was a doctor by the name of Sir William Osler, which I've spoken about him in the past, actually, and he was this really remarkable physician at Johns Hopkins, who really, I believe, if I had to pick one person who we really should study, if we're going to look at modern medicine, we should study some of his things, would be that he critiqued this. He really believed that Abraham Flexner's report had their priorities completely wrong, that they were basically thinking about the advancement of knowledge overriding everything. In other words, overriding the welfare of patients, overriding, educating students with the wrong priorities. And someone that was also part of this group by the name of Harvey Cushing, another really seminal figure, because there are certain conditions that he named, that's named after Dr. Cushing, also voiced the same sentiments, basing his reservations on several generations of practicing physicians, and the fact that there were incredible amounts of large money tied to the implementation of this particular type of evaluation of medical care. Sir William Osler, at some point moved over to Oxford University. He was mostly at Johns Hopkins, and unfortunately, when he left, all this money from Carnegie and from Rockefeller came in and really pushed things. And Sir William Osler was in Oxford at the time, and really, they didn't really weren't able to listen to him. So Osler's warning basically was that the ideals of medicine would change, as he said, quote, "Teacher and student chased each other down the fascinating road of research, forgetful of the interest to which a hospital must minister to its patients." And ultimately, if you think about how modern medicine is structured, that is a pretty accurate description. So this Flexner report really solidified how modern medicine is practiced, both in a somewhat positive way, but also basically taking all alternative medicine, putting it down here, and taking conventional medicine and sort of putting it up here in a certain way that isn't necessarily good for sort of doctor-patient relationship. So when it comes to modern medicine, we basically have, what's called the allopathic model. And that's basically defined as a medical system that aims to combat disease by using remedies, drugs and surgery. But ultimately, there are all kinds of different ways of thinking about understanding modern medicine. So how can we have a better understanding of what has been missing when it comes to looking at traditional forms of medicine and the medicine that we have just now as a result of this progression from germ theory to the Flexner report to the now this association that we have of what we call basically conventional medicine? Well, there's several different things. All forms of traditional medicine that evolved within the theoretical, religious, cultures that they evolved. I'm talking about things like traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. All of these things evolved in the cultures in such a way that they were integrated into the culture. I don't think we can necessarily say that in our context, because we don't come from in the West necessarily. In the U.S., we can't really think about it in that way. So if we look at traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and we look at all the traditional healing mechanisms around the world, what is it that we're missing? The first is a connection with nature. There's really nothing in modern medicine that is going to say that we need to be connected to nature. Every other healing and traditional healing method around the world always emphasizes a connection with nature. The next is a healing relationship between the healer and the patient. And this is so important because, again, the Flexner report degraded this by saying that the doctor is in this ultimate pursuit of truth and is sort of an academician that is not chronically, but in a perfectionist way, trying to achieve these lofty ideals of science. And ultimately, the healing relationship between doctor and patient is not honored and therefore not really cultivated. And certainly anybody who we all can basically say that the so-called bedside manner of a physician leaves a lot to be desired by most of the doctors, unfortunately, that we see. And that is it's a direct reflection of the fact that it's not made a priority in the healing modality of traditional of the conventional medicine that we have. If it was honored, then the doctor quote bedside manner wouldn't be something that we would complain about. But it's reflective again of this evolution of medicine that we have. And next is traditional medicine doesn't discount the inherent intelligence or observation of the patient. In other words, I always say that doctors can be divided into two categories. One set of doctors thinks they know more about your body than you do, and another set of doctors think that you know more than about your body than they do. And it's true, you always know more about your body than any doctor. So that's why honoring the instincts that patients have is very, very important. Next is a deeper understanding of balance. So all these traditional forms of healing have a really clear understanding of balance, not just balance, balance from a mental perspective, balance from a physical perspective, emotional, spiritual, social, all of these different aspects of our lives. Traditional methods of healing take all of these into account. That is not something that conventional medicine does, because conventional medicine has inherited the belief that the body and the mind are completely separate. In traditional forms of healing in general, from the time immemorial, there has never been a separation between the body and the mind. The body and the mind have always been one unit, and there's always been an understanding that if there's stress, if there is emotional disturbances, those are going to start to reflect themselves inside in the body. Looking at it from a Flexner report kind of report that inherits its view of science from this distinction between the body and the mind, or the fact that if it's not visible, it's not measurable, therefore it doesn't exist. When you have that sort of opinion, and that opinion unfortunately continues to this day, then there's a huge amount of healing that is going to be left out. And finally, there's the use of natural herbs and a deeper understanding of diet, environment, and all those things that go with it. And again, the traditional forms, or I should say, conventional form of medicine that we have doesn't honor that as well. So I think one of the reasons I like to discuss this is because it's true that conventional medicine can do some amazing things, incredible things. But we have to understand that if we want to have a well-rounded, healthy view of the body and healing in general, we have to take into account all these other aspects. So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. I wanted to give a little context about, again, sort of why it's important to discuss some ideas that are outside the box, understanding where we are now as a human species and the fact that we're dealing with environmental toxins like glyphosate and all kinds of chronic diseases that aren't going to be solved by new medicines necessarily. It's going to be, a lot of these chronic conditions are going to be resolved by seeing ourselves in the greater context of the environment. Then we spoke a little bit about how we evolved into the history of the medical system that we have and what's missing from that. And that's really, that's basically all I wanted to cover tonight. It was a little bit of a detour. You know, every once in a while, I like to do these detours. I appreciate your patience while I do them. Next week, I'll be interviewing actually someone about the use of algae in medicine, in healing, actually, as a supplement. It's something that I've taken for many, many years, and I think you'll find it interesting. Things like spirulina and chlorella. There's been some really interesting history there, as well as some amazing studies. And I have an expert on chlorella and spirulina that I think you'll find to be very interesting. And wish everyone a good evening. Thank you so much for your comments. Thanks, Linda. And thanks, Sharon. Appreciate your comments. And apologize for, thank you, Terry. Apologize for the little bit of technical difficulties. We had some technical difficulties last week as well. But thank you again for your patience. And see you next Wednesday